February 28th, 2026. In the space of a few hours, the fragile peace of the Middle East collapses. American and Israeli warplanes strike targets across Iran. Among the dead, Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader for over 3 decades. Within minutes, air raid sirens are screaming in Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Jerusalem. This is not a raid. This is not a warning strike. This is the opening move of a war that will reshape the region and the world's oil markets for the rest of the year.
To understand February 28th, you have to go back further. For years, Iran had been racing to expand its nuclear program, enriching uranium far beyond what any civilian energy project requires. Western intelligence agencies warned repeatedly that Tehran was edging closer to weapons-grade material. In June 2025, tensions had already boiled over once before, the so-called 12-day war, when Israel struck Iranian nuclear and military sites, and the United States joined in with strikes of its own on hardened facilities. That war ended in an uneasy ceasefire. Nothing was resolved. It was a pause, not peace.
Talks resumed in early 2026, but they went nowhere. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu pushed Washington for one more strike, this time aimed not just at facilities, but at the regime's leadership itself. In Washington, the case was made that Iran was still building toward a bomb, still funding proxy militias across the region, still a threat that could not be contained by diplomacy alone. Iran, for its part, accused the US and Israel of manufacturing a pretext for war. Regional powers like Qatar warned that any strike would be catastrophic for the entire Middle East. Nobody listened. On February 28th, the strikes came anyway. The operation was codenamed Epic Fury. Precision strikes hit Iran's military command structure and its nuclear infrastructure in a single night. Khamenei was killed. So were several senior commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Iran did not stay silent for long. Within 48 hours, retaliation came in waves. Hundreds of ballistic missiles and thousands of drones fired not just at Israel, but at American bases and US-aligned Arab states across the Gulf. Oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz came under fire. Flights across the Middle East were grounded overnight. Airspace that had carried commercial traffic for decades simply closed.
2 days after Khamenei's death, Hezbollah, Iran's most powerful regional proxy, launched its own rocket barrages into northern Israel from Lebanon. What had been a US-Israel-Iran conflict now had a second front, the Lebanon War. Israel responded with a ground campaign. By late March, over 1 million people had been driven from their homes in southern Lebanon. On March 17th, Israeli forces crossed the border. A week later, Defense Minister Israel Katz announced plans to push all the way to the Litani River, territory Israel had once occupied decades earlier during the Lebanese Civil War.
The war was no longer contained. It was spreading. Iran's most powerful card wasn't its missiles, it was geography. Nearly a fifth of the world's oil passes through the narrow Strait of Hormuz. Iran began blocking it in late March, and the effect was immediate. Global oil markets convulsed. Shipping companies rerouted entire fleets around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks and millions of dollars to every voyage. Fertilizer and natural gas supplies tightened. Airlines canceled Middle East routes outright. The United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, countries that had tried to stay out of the fight, found themselves targeted anyway after Iranian strikes hit their territory. They struck back and even clashed with Iran-aligned militias inside Iraq. A regional war that started between 3 players now had half a dozen. By June 2026, the price tag for American taxpayers alone was estimated at over $113 billion. That number didn't include the cost to global trade, to insurance markets, to ordinary families paying more at the pump from Tokyo to Toronto. On April 8th, exhausted and under enormous international pressure, both sides agreed to a 2-week ceasefire. It barely lasted. Israel resumed strikes on Lebanon. Iran refused to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, insisting any real peace deal had to include an end to the fighting in Lebanon too. A round of talks in Islamabad in mid-April collapsed without an agreement. The United States responded by imposing a full naval blockade on Iranian ports.
Then, in June, a breakthrough, or what looked like one. On June 14th, a memorandum of understanding was announced to formally end the war and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. 3 days later, in a strange, almost theatrical setting, Donald Trump signed the document at the Palace of Versailles in France. On the same day, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed his copy in Tehran. For a moment, it looked like the war might actually be over. It wasn't. Iran, even after signing the memorandum, kept trying to assert control over the Strait of Hormuz, warning ships to follow approved routes, and reportedly seeking to collect fees from vessels passing through waters it didn't legally control. On July 6th and 7th, Iranian forces fired on 3 commercial vessels in the strait. It was a direct test of the ceasefire, and the United States answered with fresh strikes on Iranian territory, aimed squarely at degrading Tehran's ability to threaten shipping. By mid-July, the blockade the U.S. had imposed months earlier was back in force. CENTCOM confirmed new rounds of strikes against Iranian targets. In a first-of-its-kind attack, American drone boats struck an Iranian vessel directly in the strait. Netanyahu, meanwhile, sent an unmistakable warning to Tehran, telling Iran's leadership not to expect a repeat of earlier restraint, that any future attack on Israel would be met with something far more powerful than before.
There were also reports, still unconfirmed in full, of multiple Iranian attempts to target Trump personally in the months following Khamenei's death. Whether or not those plots ever came close to succeeding, they added another layer of volatility to an already combustible standoff. By July 14th, the ceasefire that had been signed with such fanfare in Versailles just weeks earlier was, in practical terms, in tatters. As the summer wore on, American attention turned to a new concern, a nuclear-related facility built into a mountainside south of Iran's Natanz enrichment plant, known publicly as Pickaxe Mountain.
Satellite images showed a secured underground complex, still under construction, not yet fully operational, but close enough to raise alarm in Washington. Trump himself confirmed the site was being watched closely, saying reports of fresh activity there could not be ignored. It was a reminder that even after months of war, thousands of strikes, and a ceasefire signed by 2 heads of state, the underlying question that started this entire conflict, how close Iran actually was to a nuclear weapon, was still not fully answered. Back home, the war was becoming a political fight of its own. In Washington, Senate Democrats blocked a $1 trillion defense spending bill in protest over the administration's handling of the conflict. Markets swung on every headline, briefly cheered by cooling inflation data, then rattled again by news of fresh strikes.
As of mid-July 2026, the war has no clean ending in sight. The Strait of Hormuz remains a flashpoint, with Iran testing the edges of the ceasefire and the U.S. and Israel responding with force each time. Lebanon remains scarred by the fighting that spilled over from the Israel-Hezbollah front. Gulf states that tried to stay neutral have been pulled in regardless, and global markets are still adjusting to a world where one of its most vital shipping lanes can be shut down on a moment's notice. What began as a single night of airstrikes in February has become one of the most consequential wars of the decade, not because any one battle was decisive, but because it touched everything: oil, food supply chains, air travel, financial markets, and the fragile balance of power across an entire region.
Wars like this rarely end with a single signature on a single document. The Versailles Memorandum was supposed to be that moment. It wasn't. What happens next in the Strait of Hormuz, in Lebanon, and at a mountain facility south of Natanz? That will decide whether 2026 is remembered as the year a fragile peace finally held, or the year a wider war began. For now, the ceasefire papers exist.
the guns have not gone quiet.